Hi everyone, my name is Suriñach Campos, and today I will be talking about my visualizing peace journey and everything that I have learned and everything that I have continued to research and that I have started researching during the second semester in which I have taken this visualizing peace BAP. So we will start with war memorials. Now, we started this research after a collaboration with the War Memorials VAP, which is a VAP project that was studying the memorialization of war in the context of the American Civil War. And it became very interesting to me, the idea of how certain instances of memorialization of wars are used in the name of peace, and how the word peace is used very frequently with these sort of like memorials of conflicts, of armed conflicts, in order to justify the victory and therefore sort of like retro justify a conflict. One of the examples that I have sort of like studied is Trajan's column in a more sort of like in a clause that's more like ancient history related. And so with Trajan column, we have this idea of a monument erected after the victory over the Dacians, where the whole war is sort of like justified in the final victory. One example that was particularly interesting to us and to our research was Plaque 53, which shows the peace accord, right? That is that they call between Trajan and the Kebalus. Now, this is obviously a surrender because the Dacians surrendered to Trajan after he conquered Dacia, and so there is this sort of like implication that peace is only achieved through military victory. And so this is interesting because by erecting a monument that is constantly seen by the public of in this case of Rome, you would have been portraying this sort of like connection between victory, military victory, and peace, and so obviously creating an idea of peace that is only peace to the is only a real peace to the victorious, to the conquered. It is just a form of oppression and of mass oppression by the forces of the state. So it was also interesting to find out that Trajan decided to be buried under this memorial of war, right? So then there is a big intersection between war memorials and between the graves of great leaders that sort of like legitimize their power and legitimize their identity with sort of like peace, with this misguided idea of peace. Um, so we will see now a more modern example of the same, which happened during the Civil War with Franco. So after Civil War ends and Generalissimo dictator Francisco Franco is put in power, he erects the monument of the Valley of the Fallen, which is sort of like a monument to the everlasting peace that will come after this conflict and after the communists and the Democrats have finally sort of like been vanquished. And it is a monument erected to the fallen, but only to the fallen of one side. So in this case, we it begets the question of like how much is this instance of memorialization just an instance of perpetrator's peace, because it doesn't really offer solace to the whole population. It only offers solace to a part of it, which is the part that was on one of the sides. In instances of civil war, the idea of memorialization becomes especially touchy, as we found with the people in the war memorials VAP, because it only caters more a lot of the times to one side of the population, and in order to achieve an actual real long-lasting peace, there must be a sort of like common understanding of history by both sides. We can see here some examples of how this is still a very relevant issue in modern society in Spain. Only recently, 2 years ago, Franco was exhumated from the Valley of the Fallen. There were still a lot of pushback about around that, and a lot of people that were against him being taken out of the Valley of the Fallen. Again, coming back to the idea with Trajan that the dictator, that the leader gets buried under his own war memorial to legitimize his image as part of the peace and the oppression that he brought. So after this short overview over some of the research that I have been doing, I will go on to talk about my main um, peace project, which has been a literary study of the images of peace in Tolkien, about the imagery related to the Tolkienian mythos, and how that relates to peace. So this is a research that's coming off of my first semester, where I started researching how can we connect peace to Tolkien, and what is it about Tolkien that instills peace in us, even though we have a sort of perception of a very militaristic, very conflict-related storytelling. And so after some interviews, I found that there is a certain level of disconnect between a reception of Tolkienian ideas and the actual works of Tolkien, and that scholars agree in this difference between the reception and the imagery of Tolkien and the actual contents and ideas of Tolkien. There is a disconnect where part of the messages of peace are lost. And so, with that in mind, I decided that it would be a good idea to try to understand the different traditions of illustration, and and sort of like try to understand where certain ideas of the original Tolkien had been lost. So here in this slide, we can see just three different lines of of artworks by him. Artworks that relate to him. The first one is actually by him. It's a drawing by Tolkien, and the drawings by Tolkien, when we study them, we see that they're all very similar. They're all drawings that focus on nature. Characters are almost non-existent, and so they are representative of what the actual author had in mind as the focus of his story, which is his world, which is the fantasy environment and the fantastical, sort of like idyllic, pastoral-like world that he devised where his stories took place. This is the center, and this is his biggest achievement in his own view, and it is a very idyllic, almost utopic kind of understanding of the world, where he sort of like uses fantasy as a way to imagine a better, more prosperous, more interesting and harmonious world. This is something that is quite clear when you actually understand his drawings, but then other drawing traditions that have interpreted in their own ways what they read in Tolkien's works have gone other ways. So in the middle, I wanted to put an instance of good sort of like illustration of Tolkien. It is made by Mary Fairburn, one of the few illustrators that we know Tolkien approves of. Tolkien was very critical of most of the interpretations of his work. And on the right, we have one that which we have just a picture from the Peter Jackson movies, which brought a lot of readers and brought a lot of people into the world of J.R.R. Tolkien, but did so at the cost of many of its messages, at least according to many scholars, because it is very militarizing, and it is militarizing the content in a way in which the natural world and the fantasy like realms that Tolkien sort of like took as the focus become second place, and the first place becomes all these sort of like more Hollywood-esque like instances of war, glorifying battles and focusing on conflict. So we were lucky enough to be able to contact Mr. Ted Nasmith during this semester. Ted Nasmith is considered one of the best illustrators of Tolkien, arguably in the world. Here on the left, we have one of his pictures that he drew at an early age, and that Tolkien actually saw and sort of like reviewed. And so he has gone on to become one of the most influential illustrators of Middle Earth, both Lord of the Rings, Hobbit, and especially the Silmarillion. He is probably the most extensive and best considered illustrator of the Silmarillion, one of Tolkien's works, which I have taken a special focus on during this research project, and so his insight will be greatly appreciated in my research project as we try to understand what is this ethereal quality found in Tolkien's literature that has been sort of like hard and not sometimes unsuccessful to portray in the movies or other adaptations, but that the readers keep finding in his books, and we get all these accounts of readers finding peace in Tolkien's world and finding peace in its books, despite the many conflicts that permeate the world. And so this act of fantasy of creation was what we were interested on and what we will discuss with Ted Nasmith um, more in extension. And so as my research project went on, I sort of like felt naturally inclined to start thinking about how would an idea of Tolkien's world that focused on peace look like. We have a lot of depictions of the wars of the Lord of the Rings. We have a lot of depictions of the worlds of the Lord of the Rings, of the races, of everything, but there weren't really many depictions that focused on peace when illustrating his world. And so that was something that I was as an artist, I felt a sort of like curiosity to explore. And as I researched more, I sort of discovered, or at least sort of like started arguing that the piece that is so elusive but so present, apparently, according to readership and scholars in the Lord of the Rings, is found in the act of what's called poiesis, the act of creation from nothing, as an oppositional force in the mind of Tolkien to destruction, conflict, war. Peace was found in creation from nothing, right? This sort of like very poetic, literary idea of a creature, a world, a lake, just any sort of like object or part of nature being created, being sprung into existence, and that there was a peace in that process that generated peace in human beings. And so I was interested in that, and I started to sort of like look into the literature and see what instances in the books are like more clearly defined as being acts of poiesis that might be generating these messages to readers. And so, I made some some first sketches, and then I decided to make two paintings where I would be trying to represent with peace, quite personally and artistically, but then also sort of like basing it of the research, the academic research that I had conducted, what peace in Tolkien meant to me. This is the first of my outputs based on my research. That was The Shores of Tol Eressëa, and it shows Frodo going into the Undying Lands after he sort of like has been unable to find peace in Middle Earth after the trauma and the PTSD from the conflict that he has been through has made him unable to enjoy his home. He finds comfort in this sort of like departing into the Undying Lands. More Christian reading of this instance might be sort of like a pathway into heaven, but it might also be a more sort of like fantasy like understanding of just sort of like an Eden where people can actually find peace. It is a hopeful sort of like a final note to quite the sort of like dark journey that the main protagonist has been on internally. And it is an instance of ultimately, I thought, of peace and of sort of like the glory of creation, right? So the rains sort of suddenly that the rains and the curtain of clouds that has been sort of like obstructing the view of the ship suddenly moves away, and Frodo is exposed to the glory of creation. It talks about white shores and green fields and just lights. Um, and so it is quite a moment that I thought was moving, was indicative of the peace that is represented, a very calm, a very pastoral piece that is represented in his works. And so I decided to try to represent it as best I could with a color palette that was very soft, without any sort of like stark or dark colors. I used exclusively oil paints in a wet technique, so that everything would sort of like have this dreamlike quality that doesn't feel real, because these undying lands sort of like um, have a very ethereal, almost fantasy, like inside of the fantasy world, have a very fantasy like sort of like context. Um, and so this was one of my outputs. All of the these two paintings will be exposed during the exposition that we will have with St. Andrew's residents on the 18th of April. And this was the first one. This second output is from the Silmarillion, and it is the instance when the elves are born. So this is in a very early age, that is before the sun even sort of like was created in this world. There is an eternal night, and sort of like the gods are the only ones that exist. They're either in conflict with Melkor, with like the evil god, and they're sort of like doing their thing. They know that the elves and the mortals have to appear at some point, but they don't know when. So they're in another part of the world, battling Melkor and everything. So their conflict is already a part of this world. But then in this little corner of the world, in the lakes and the Mere, said in English, of Cuivianen, suddenly one day the elves just awaken. And there isn't pain, there isn't conflict, there isn't any kind of like sort of like painful coming of being, as birth is very commonly sort of like attributed to pain. They just awaken. They awaken and they look at the stars, and because they find the stars so beautiful and the reflection of the stars so beautiful, they will always be called Eldar. They will always be called sort of like the people of the stars, and that's the name that the elves get. And this is also a moment that I thought was sort of like wonderfully inclusive and representative of this sort of like elusive peace, found in creation, in silence, in calmness, in the contemplation of the world, of the natural world, and the natural coming of things, that I thought exemplified what peace looks like in the Silmarillion. Um, and so again, I tried to use a palette of colors, in this case exposing the nights, which obviously is darker, but still finding beauty in darkness. As the same way as like peace processes and peace reconciliation is not always in lights, found in lights, and it's a lot of the times peace. In order to fight for peace, dark places are the ones that must be sort of like treated and explored. It is important that we learn to find peace in darkness, and I think that this idea of finding beauty and finding peace in the nights instead of in the sort of like glaring, more obvious light of the sun, of daylight, is sort of like I think quite poetic of sort of like what we've been talking about with this VIP, more generally. So I tried to find a night that was shiny in its own right, that didn't need a sun for it to be shiny, and so that the stars and these more like sort of like less spectacular lights could shine better because of the lack of the sun. Um, and so this is the second of my outputs, and I I hope that that was sort of like that in its more like artistic sense, was able to give some some answers into what my output and my conclusions of what peace means in Tolkien are. So thank you very much, and thank you for listening to my presentation.